So really quickly, how's everybody doing?
Good.
Good. Everybody survived their week, I hope. Obviously, you're here. Okay, so, hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, how are you?
Okay, so really quickly, we covered last week the new faith that was happening during our time, and that faith is Islam, started up. And we also covered a little bit of the Crusades and how the Crusades dealt with this impeding faith onto Christian homelands.
What years are we in right now? Sorry.
Well, we went, we did a huge jump yesterday, and we went all the way up into the Crusades, which was the 1200s. Okay? Now, what we're going to do, though, today is I didn't want to say, okay, well, we're going to do a battle here and a battle here. We're going to talk about the First Crusade, but let's talk about what's going on scholarly-wise and then jump back into the Crusades. So I just wanted to cover the Crusades as a military conquest into the securing of Holy Land sites. That's the most important thing you need to know. Did it work? Not really, okay? Because whatever land that it did conquer, in the end, in the grand scheme of time, you lost that land again, okay? But you also caused a huge amount of repercussions and culture clashes that are going on during this time period too. And it's not just Muslim and Christian, it's Christian against Christian. Yeah, I know, your eyes are lighting up over there. No, it's okay, because that's the whole thing, is that people are different. So today, we're doing another huge leap in time today. We're going to cover roughly 300 years of history, but I want to go back in time a little bit because I didn't want to talk about this while we were talking about the Crusades, because I felt that it would take away from the Crusades. Is I want to talk about what theological scholar work that's going on during the time of the Crusades. So I call this Dawn of the Reformation because a lot of people are like, oh, Martin Luther. Because, just the other day we had the 500-year anniversary of the Reformation. October 31st was the 500-year anniversary of the Reformation of the Church. The official Reformation of the Church. But the one thing is the Reformation actually started several hundred years before that. Now, do you guys remember when we did that lecture on the Bible, that we talked about that even in the 1200s, people are like, whoa, the Bible should be available to everybody? And then the clergy's like, no, I think only the clergy should have the Bible. That right there is the beginning of the Reformation. Martin Luther just became the spearhead of that. We'll talk about that later. Now, during this time period, though, before what happens is, remember how we talked about how the Muslim faith, they crossed into northern Africa and how they actually invaded into Spain. And so the Spanish territory was all held by Moorish people. And so what happened was what was known as the Reconquista. And so the ancient Visigoth kingdom of Spain was destroyed by the Muslims in the 8th century. It's all taken over by the Moors. And so what happened was the group just north of Spain, as well as the Franks, start what's known as a Reconquista. And so they start taking over Spain again. And so they slowly start from the north of Spain and make their way down, pushing the Moors out. And as they're pushing the Moors out, it's not to be, don't think of it as like a romantic adventure of knights in armor and they're clashing and stuff. If that's how come I love this painting, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much what it is.
Yeah.
Okay? It's slaughter. It's mowing down. And what happened is it's not just, as I mentioned, Muslim against Christian, it's Christian against Christian in a lot of places. Because remember, they're having huge theological differences at this time as well. The Nicenes and the Arianists are competing against each other as well. Now, this whole Reconquista leads to a unification of Christian Spain, as well as the founding of the tomb of St. James. Okay, so this is like a huge thing that happens, okay? Early church, how do you make yourself known? You say, oh, an apostle or a saint was buried here. And so the story is that James makes his way all the way to Spain. And there he dies. I know, it sounds kind of ridiculous from a modern archaeological point of view, but they love the story. And so they found the tomb of St. James. Remember how we talked about reliquaries and other artifacts selling in the Middle Ages? You just didn't sell a reliquary, you sold a tomb. Okay, so they found the tomb of St. James. And so this becomes a huge rally point for these Christians. To the point that, that this actually becomes a major pilgrimage spot for Western Europeans. So instead of making your way to Jerusalem to fight in the Crusades, the tomb of St. James becomes a separate route as well that you could travel down. And so this actually turns St. James into the patron saint of the entire country of Spain. In fact, to the point that in Spanish, they actually had a word for it, and it was called Santiago Matamoros, which means St. James the Moor Slayer. And that became a battle cry for them. And so Moorish territory would shrink down until, now it's a horrible map, and I apologize because it's kind of blurry. Oh wow, it's even worse when it's big. So all of this at one time was once held by Moors. This is the last piece of Moorish territory. The territory of Granada. Otherwise, they've been pushed all the way back into North Africa. And that will actually remain Moorish territory all the way. It becomes the only existing Moorish territory in 1248. And it stays Moorish territory until 1492. And the only way that it was allowed to happen was because they were paying tribute to the King of Castile. And still finally, with Ferdinand and Isabella, the famous king and queen who sent Columbus on his voyage, they were like, that's it, they gotta go too. And so they started this huge expulsion of the Moors, and so to where even Granada is not available to them. But the only thing is there's huge consequences of the Crusades. One, mistrust between Christians and Muslims. Who would have guessed? Okay? So even in quasi-friendly territories, there's still a huge amount of mistrust. But also, something else happens in this area. And I love this. A gentleman comes out of this whole thing of this conquest of Spain. Rodriguez Diaz de Vecpa. Everybody else knows him as El Cid. Made a great Charlton Heston movie out of it.
Yeah.
I mean, but I love this because I'm originally from San Diego. That's the equestrian statue of El Cid out of Balboa Park. Thank you. But he's also, he's very famous in Spain. He's like the Abraham Lincoln of Spain, really. They love him there. Now, also, the popes gained huge amount of power through the Crusades, controlling more territory. By the time of the Fourth Crusade, the Pope, by the name of Innocent II, has actually helped the papacy reach their apex by controlling completely parts of Eastern and Western Europe and has retaken Constantinople for the Christians. Now the only thing is the Crusades also helped Christian piety in general, because these crusaders and other pilgrims who have never been to the Middle East, for the first time you're having travelers of Europeans to the Middle East. They're bringing back knowledge, they're bringing back culture. People are becoming actually more grounded in the idea of what life was like during biblical times instead of simply reading it in the Bible. But also this is a time of huge expansion of literature, music, poetry. So everybody there's huge jumps in there. Now there's also something that's going on in this time, and it's theological scholasticism. A lot of people are writing a bunch of different things during the time of the Crusades. So when we talk about the Reformation starting with Luther, no. It really starts up during the time of the Crusades. This is a gentleman by the name of Anselm. And one of the things that's very interesting is that he's from Normandy. Anybody ever heard of Normandy before? The famous landing by the Americans in World War II? It's actually in France. And he's originally from Normandy, which means during this time period, he's a Viking with a bad haircut. And what happened is he was actually in 1096 sent over to England to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. The only thing is, the English king at the time didn't like him, and so he had him thrown into exile. And so, while he spent so many years in exile, he actually spent 7 years in exile. He meditated and wrote on theological issues. And this actually became a book that was called the Proslogion. And out of this, I love this. This is actually one of my favorite sayings out of Anselm. He says, "I do not seek, Lord, to reach your heights, for my intellect is nothing compared to them." And he's referring to other people. "But I seek in some way to understand your truth, which my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand in order to believe, but rather to believe in order to understand."
Cool.
This is coming out of an 11th century mind. Okay. And he also wrote another famous treatise that was written during this time called "Why Did God Become Man?" And so he's writing huge also theological books on this as well. What makes us worthy? Why? Why would he want to? Now another person during this time period who's also very famous for his theological works is a gentleman by the name of Peter Abelard. And his life was actually so wrought with troubles. His most famous autobiography he ever wrote was basically, I think it's called A Life of Bad Circumstances or something like that, of tragedies. And it certainly did. He was a theologian who was entrusted with the education of a high-ranking church leader's niece. And the teacher and the student became lovers, and she bore him a son. And for that, he was hunted down and emasculated. Yeah. But the only thing is he actually sought down a monastic life after that, and he was still hunted down, but people did protect him. And under this monastic retreat, he wrote many things. One of the treatises he wrote was actually something that was called Yes and No. No, it is. It's actually pretty good. What was it? It was 158 theological questions. And he wrote what the Bible says versus what theologians at the time said. And showed how they disagreed. And so he's again, remember, this is the stuff that'll fuel that Reformation. And one of the things that he said was he said that theology must not be content on citing authorities. Which means just because somebody had an interesting, it's like just because somebody has PhD on the end of the name doesn't mean they should become the end all. Because as Sherry once taught me, PhD means poor, helpless, and desperate. Okay. Another one is, this is actually one of the things, I love this, also something that Peter said. It is by doubting that we come to investigate, and by investigating that we recognize the truth. Abelard. So it's like one of those things, question the authority. Find out for yourself. And when you question, and you question sincerely, you will be given the answers. Peter Lombard, another famous writer during this time period. He wrote a book, actually, called The Book of Sentences, and this book was written in 1150, which is also the time of the Crusades. And he wrote what is known as a gloss. And it's really interesting, and I have to check if this is where the word comes from. You guys ever heard the term like to gloss over something?
Yeah.
Well, what a gloss was during this time period is it was like little tiny footnotes that people would write in between margins of books as in to explain something. So it's like the Cliff Notes version. So to gloss over something, he wrote a famous book that was called The Four Sentences. And these are actually used as explanations of syntax, grammar, and doctrine. They were usually in the margins of books. And this one book that he wrote, called The Four Book of Sentences, would be used as a huge theological text all the way up to the 15th century. So it obviously affected people so much that people are using it for almost 400 years. And then, of course, Thomas Aquinas. Rob's like, born in 1224 in Naples. He was actually sent to the University of Naples to study philosophy, but decided to become a Dominican monk, which actually upset his parents so much that they locked him up in the family castle. I wish they'd still do that today. But the one thing is that he was actually known for his size, because he was just like a really big guy, and he was known to be quiet, and so people just called him the Dumb Ox. That was actually his nickname when he went to school. But the only thing is, there was absolutely nothing dumb about him. And he actually became a famous professor on theology. And he wrote 2 books during this time period that were very much worth noting. One is called the Summa Contra Gentiles, which basically is a manual for missionaries on how to deal with Muslims.
Did he say to treat them well or slaughter them?
Well, I think what it is it's probably a book on apologetics.
Oh.
You know, on trying to bridge the faith. Have you read that, Rob?
No.
Come on.
Rob.
Tonight.
And the other one is actually one of his most famous books, and it was the Summa Theologica, and he actually wrote this from 1265 to 1274. And this actually is the main compendium of everything in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
This is like the book. And then it covered actually the existence of God, creation, sacraments, man's purpose, and how to get back to God. But one of the things that was very interesting about him is that he had started having a period of time where he started to write less and less. Why? Because he was having mystical visions. And he had a series of these mystical experiences, and one time he told a friend, "I can write no more. I have seen things that make all my writings like straw." And then he stopped writing altogether and he died 1 year later. So whatever visions that he was having actually compelled him to stop writing altogether. Another huge theological writer during this time period, John Wycliffe. We talked about him at the very beginning of, not at the very beginning, we talked about him during our History of the Bible lecture. And he's actually born in the 1320s. He's a philosopher, theologian, Bible translator, and seminary professor at Oxford. Not a bad gig, I guess. But the only thing is he attacked the clergy, who he thought at this time was a privileged class, which they were. A lot of the priests and bishops and stuff like that are gaining power, they're amassing wealth. Some of the bishops at this time period actually have relatives that are minor lords. They're getting bestowed lands to where even the bishops themselves are becoming lords. And so he attacks this. He translates the Bible from the Vulgate Latin to the Middle English, and this actually becomes the Wycliffe Bible. And he worked mainly on the New Testament while associates did the Old. He completed this in 1384. So he actually writes the first Bible. He's known for attacking veneration of saints, the sacraments, the Requiem, masses, transubstantiation, and monasticism.
Oh.
Yes.
Is that Bible available?
Yeah.
Somewhere?
Rob, you can still get a Wycliffe version of the Bible, right? But that's in Middle English, I would think, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not gonna. You're gonna have to go online.
Yeah, you can
Find
probably
out.
go online and you may be able to see scans of a Wycliffe Bible, even an original Wycliffe
From that
Bible.
time, from that.
Yeah, they probably have scans of it if they're earning. I'm sure that even during this time, yeah, he's already looking at it.
Biblia.com has it on.
They have a Wycliffe Bible.
Yeah, Biblia.com.
Biblia?
Biblia.
All right, thanks.
I always think that's one of the things I always think is kind of ironic is that the word biblio simply means book, is where we get the word Bible. So we managed to like monopolize the entire word for book is Bible. But also one of the things that was very interesting is his followers became another group of people that were called the Lollards. And the Lollards, which is actually a derogatory nickname, meaning someone who was lowly educated, they only knew English. And by the 15th century, the Lollards would be used synonymously with the word heretic.
Oh.
Now, Wycliffe would actually inspire a Czech by the name of Jan Hus, who will be executed in 1415. And this actually starts what's known as a Hussite War, or a papal war, where actually princes, because we no longer have emperors, we now have kings and princes, but principalities are now organizing armies to stand against the Catholic Church. So it became known as the Hussite Wars. And so you'd actually have these minor principalities duking it out throughout Eastern Europe, because some of these princes are backing the Catholic Church, and some of them are upset with the execution of Jan Hus. Now, hopefully I haven't gone too far. Oh, another unfortunate map that when you blow it up blurs too much. Okay, so the Black Sea is right here. Now, unfortunately, the reason I wanted to show this area is because this is a hot spot in Eastern Europe during this time period. Because here's the Black Sea. So the Black Sea is right here. You guys got me? And so Italy, it's kind of like right here. Black Sea, Constantinople, and then the Middle East. So this is all Turks. Ottoman Empire. This is all Turks. Okay, and so they're imposing on this area. We're talking to Rob about that this morning. Something interesting happened in history. Can I bring up my inner nerd?
Yes, do it.
Okay. Okay, this area right here, known as Wallachia, becomes a hot spot because it's right here on the Turkish Empire. Okay? And during this time period, there is a guy by the name of Vlad II, who they actually have the whole language that they're speaking in this area is Romanian. And the one thing is Vlad II becomes indoctrinated into an order of knights to protect the Christian Empire from the Moors. They call it the Order of the Dragon. And on their shield device was actually a huge dragon. And the only thing is Vlad II, the guy's a beast, okay? But he does happen to secure all of this Wallachia area, Transylvania, Moldavia. Him and his men are securing this whole area from the Ottoman Empire. So what happens is Constantinople falls in 1453 to the Turks, and they're full on plowing their way through here. Next thing you know, Vlad II dies. His son takes over, Vlad III. The Romanian name for dragon is Dracul. Vlad III becomes Dracula. Vlad Tepes. Yeah, the whole infamous story of Dracula and vampires comes out of this Romanian knight. Bring out your inner nerd. And then some writer from Ireland in the 1890s comes up with this story and he hears about it and he goes, "That sounds kind of cool." So that's where the story actually came from. And Vlad III is actually a Romanian. He's a Wallachian knight who secures Christendom against the Turks. But the only thing is, just like his dad, he's got a very extreme way of doing it. He likes to impale his enemies on spikes. That's how come his name became Vlad the Impaler. And he became like, it's kind of like a very medieval way of saying, hey, you kids, stay off my lawn. Because he actually would, he would line the entire territory with dead bodies. Thousands of them. To the point that he went down in history as the person that he did. And very simply, he was just part of the war against the Turks. Now, hello.
Hello.
So, something else happens during this time period, this whole time period in general, that brings about part of the Reformation, with huge mass content with the peasant class, inequality, peasant revolts, apocalyptic visions, and a call for a new order. Out of this starts something very interesting. Remember how Spain went through their whole, like, flushing out the Moors? It was big throughout Europe, but Spain became famous for it. Inquisition. And out of this came Tomás Torquemada. Came like the, you guys thought we were about done with all the horrible history last week, huh? No, I got more. And this is kind of sad, actually, because there's always been what's known as an inquisition since the beginning. And all an inquisition was a group of bishops that would travel from town to town, and if there was ever a question with doctrine, they'd bring that one bishop up, and then you kind of like, okay, we're all on the same page, right? And if you weren't on the same page, they would say, maybe you might want to take up plumbing. You know, because that's not what the church was about. So there's always been an inquisition. But with this whole fervor of this post-crusade, the peasant revolts, everything that's going on, they finally say, we need to move that whole idea of the Inquisition into the lay community as well. Not just amongst ourselves. And out of that comes the famous Inquisition. And Spain was notorious for it. Yes?
Is this guy unhappy just because of the bad haircut?
Yeah, that was pretty common during that time period. That type of, depending on what order of monks you were, yeah, that's not good, man.
Does he have a cap on?
No, it's not. They actually would shave the bald,
Oh,
and then they'd have that little tuft of hair going
I was
around.
reading that as a cap. Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yes, miss?
So the famous Spanish Inquisition, forgive me, I don't remember it, it was people going into the lay people, like houses?
Yeah,
and
bishops would,
asking them-
you would actually hold ecclesiastical trials. To where if you were found or thought of to not be in line with the common church doctrine at the time, you were brought upon ecclesiastical trial. And you were held for that. It could be a fine, that is money or property, and it could be even up to death, depending on what offense that the church found you guilty of.
Was it geared towards Christian
Oh yeah, it's against Christian and Jew.
and Jew?
Oh boy. To the point that under Tomás Torquemada, 200,000 Jews were expelled from Spain. Most of them were killed. But that's also one of the things that goes with the unfortunate part of the trials, is that the church does not, remember how we speak about the church does not shed blood. The church never shed a single drop of blood. They would hold the trial, you would be found guilty, and then you'll be handed to civil authorities and they will carry out the sentence. That way they don't have to get their hands dirty. Now, this actually gives, out of all this mess, and it's a mess, okay, comes a very interesting group of people. The humanists. And today we think of humanists as non-believers. It's a polite way of saying non-believer. Nowadays it is, but back then a humanist was simply somebody who used had a very classical mind about them. They used Socratic arguments. They knew the works of Plato. They believed in these human rights that people were endowed with. Didn't necessarily become a term used for somebody who was a non-believer. And probably one of the most famous, earliest ones is this gentleman right here. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. And he becomes known as the Prince of Humanists. He's actually the illegitimate son of a priest and a physician's daughter. And that's actually something he never lived down. And he actually used it to fuel his fire. The humanists actually embraced classical literature and thought, and he wrote a book that was called The Dagger, or Handbook of the Christian Soldier. And he used military terms mixed with theology and gave what would be a more balanced Christian life. He referred to the person as a soldier of Christ. Preached Jesus using Stoicism and other classical thought. Subject of passion to the rules of reason. And the Christian struggle is an inner one. But one of the things that he was also against was he was against baptism. He wasn't against the act of baptism himself, because this is what he says about it. He says, "What good is it to be sprinkled with holy water if one is filthy within?" And that will also give birth to other movements that we'll talk about a little later on. And then, of course, Rob's been waiting for this for weeks. Martin Luther. No, just kidding.
Drum roll.
Yeah. No, Martin Luther, born in 1483 in Germany. Okay? Studious, uncouth, and even known to be rude. I like him already. But he's extremely sincere. And he joins a monastery when he's 22, and he's fervent and happy with the decision, but he also found problems with other things such as confessionals. He thinks that's kind of like, subjugating himself to a person as opposed to directly to God. And for a while, he actually explored Christian mysticism for a while. But his great epiphany happens in 1915 when lecturing on Epistle to the Romans of the just. I'm sorry?
1950.
I'm sorry, 1515.
Okay.
This Brit. I'm sorry. In 1515, he writes a sermon on the epistles of the Romans. And the just shall live by faith. And Luther found that the justice of God is unbearable. And the way he says it is, he contemplated this and founded that the faith of justification is a true gift to sinners. And so this is what he says. I felt that I had been born anew and that the gates of heaven had been opened. The whole of Scripture gained a new meaning. And from that point on, the phrase, the justice of God, no longer filled me with hatred, but rather became unspeakably sweet by virtue of a great love.
Oh, that's cool.
Now, my little footnote to you guys is, before you guys get all fuzzy about this, let me tell you what else he said. Many have taken the Christian faith to be simple and easy manner, and has even numbered it among the virtues. This is because they have not really experienced it, nor have they tested any great strength of faith. It's a nice way of saying it's easy to be Christian when times are good. Wait till you're tested and see how your Christianity holds up. Now, the storm broke on all this when the Pope at the time, Pope Leo X, started the mass selling of what's known as indulgences. Okay? Which is basically buying your way out of hell and into heaven. It's a nice way of saying it. This causes Luther to write a famous pamphlet, which is called the 95 Theses, and he has it nailed to the church door at Wittenberg, and copies were sent throughout the empire and to Rome. Needless to say, Pope Leo was not pleased. And what happened is Luther actually gets called up to a famous debate between a university professor by the name of John Eck and Luther have this debate. Luther knows Scripture. Eck knows canonical law. Okay? And medieval theology. And Luther then claims that the execution of Jan Hus was wrong, and this is his reason why he said it was wrong. He said, a Christian with the support of the Scripture has more authority than all the popes and the bishops. Oops. This actually has him labeled as a heretic. And then many papal bulls are issued demanding Luther to recant. Pope calls Luther, I love this, a boar loose in the Lord's vineyard. I'm getting that made into a t-shirt. That'd be great for the 500-year anniversary, I think. And orders all of his books to be burned. When Luther receives the bull, the papal bull, he burns it. And along with other books of what he calls popish doctrines. Luther goes into hiding, and during his time of 10 years, he writes the Bible into German, which actually helps unify the German people. See, the one thing that's very interesting from a historical point of view, that whole thing that we call Germany today is actually a pretty modern country. The country of Germany itself doesn't exist until the 1800s. Before that, that's how come I'm a Revolutionary War nut. You guys ever heard of the Hessians?
Yeah.
That's because they're from the German province of Hesse. And then, of course, they have the Prussians and all these other Germanic, they're tribes. Until finally, and then the Burgundians, they all finally come together to form the country which we now call Germany. But during this time, Luther's time, there is no German. There's a German language, but they're still all there broken up into their different areas. He, by translating the Bible into Germany, helps unify Germany. Now, Luther actually marries a former nun by the name of Katharina von Bora, and they have 6 children together, and he refers to their home as a small church. Erasmus and Luther will eventually face off, though. Erasmus criticized the ignorance and corruption of the clergy, but never advocated the Reformation, and that'll pitch him against Luther. And so those two people will go against each other. And because of that, many humanists will not back the Lutheran movement during this time period. Including that will also cause that separation between the Church of England, because we'll talk about that next time. Henry VIII, we'll talk about Henry VIII and the Church of England, because that whole idea of you can't marry this person, that break off in the Catholic Church, that's how come they didn't become Lutheran. They broached off in their different things because of the humanist movement that was really strong in England at that time period.
And part of that series actually hit pretty hard on that.
On the humanism movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the one thing that's very interesting is there's a lot more in common with the humanist movement and the Lutheran movement than there'll ever be with the Catholic Church at that time period. But that whole I want to get a divorce thing is what actually causes the whole birth of a different church. This is one of the things that's very interesting, is that in 1526, princes who backed Lutheran ideals make an official stand against the Catholic Church. This is the line now drawn in the sand. And this was deemed a formal protest. And so, they became Protestants.
Protestants.
Protestants. Okay? And this leads to the edge of war throughout Europe. The Protestants versus the Catholics.
Yep.
Boy, we'll see this a few times.
Stay out of Ireland.
Yeah, stay out of Ireland. Again, that kind of depends on whose backyard you're in at the time.
Whatever.
What happened is this actually led to pretty much to a war that was actually stopped and what's known as the Peace of Nuremberg, which was signed in 1523. And the reason for this actual peace to happen was because of invasion of the Turks.
Oh.
They still had that problem in Eastern Europe. They're still worried about a Turkish invasion. They're like, there's no reason for the Protestants and the Catholics to be fighting it out because of the Turkish invasion. And so a peace is signed in Nuremberg. Now the one thing is let's talk a little bit about Luther himself. Let's talk about what he believed. Basics of Luther's theology. The Word of God is God. Right out of John. In the beginning the Word was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Bible, in the Word incarnate, is Jesus. Luther stated that it was God who chose the Scriptures, not the Church, and so the Church did not have authority over Scripture. That's a rude awakening. Also, what he called the theology of the cross. Knowing God, not just in His glory, but also in His human weakness in the cross. And that if we develop in that, we develop a more intimate relationship through Christ. Sacraments. Luther didn't subscribe to the thought of transubstantiation. Did that? Though he did feel that Christ was present during communion, but he did not believe that Christ himself actually becomes the bread and the wine. This is one of my most interesting things I think is very interesting about Luther, which separates him from others. He believed in what was called the two kingdoms. And the two kingdoms says this: one is under the law, and the other is under the gospel. The state must operate under the law, and its main purpose is to set limits to human sin and its consequences. Believers belong to the kingdom of the gospel. Christians should not expect the state to be ruled by the gospel or support orthodoxy by persecuting heretics. In the kingdom of the gospel, the state has no power. Christians are not subject to the state and owe it no allegiance, but believers are once justified and sinners. Therefore, we are under the authority of the state. Separation of church and state. Way back then. Christian threats upon princes, constant threats upon princes that are backed by the Reformation by the Catholic Church would eventually lead to violence, and even Luther would advocate taking up arms to protect what would be the Protestant faith during this time period. Now another person during this time period, have fun saying that one, Ulrich Zwingli. He's actually spent a lot of time in the early 1500s hanging out with Swiss mercenaries, the Landsknecht. And these guys were used throughout Europe to fight wars. And by hanging out with them, he realized that this mercenary lifestyle was ripping apart the society of Switzerland. And this is inspired by Luther's ideas. He makes a break from the Catholic Church, and he secretly marries. And he actually brought huge lengths to public education in Switzerland. He also believes that changes in the church structure should be set up as well, including he actually starts his own version of the Reformation in that northern section of Europe, including during this time period, priests and nuns will be allowed to be married. And Luther and Zwingli's ideas on theology are super similar to each other. And he only disagreed on a few things, and this would actually give rise to the two major Protestant factions. Lutheranism, and the Reformed Church comes out of this. And a certain group of this Reformed Church, let me make sure we're doing okay. All right. And a certain group of this Reformed Church stated that infant baptism must be rejected. Okay? And it was and that baptism was an outward expression of you becoming a member of the church. And these followers became known as the Anabaptists, to be re-baptized. Because in the Catholic Church, a child is baptized as soon as possible, because they believe that if the child dies and hasn't been baptized, that child will go to hell.
Oh, they went to purgatory.
Purgatory, yes.
It's just south of hell, isn't it?
Just south of hell. It's next to Calexico. But the one thing is that he said, no, this should be something that's made, the decision made as an adult. And so huge Anabaptist movements start up.
Was that Luther or the?
Out of the Reformed Church. Yeah, the Anabaptist movement. And one of their most important followers is, well, here's like a picture of mass baptisms that took place. One of the big movers and shakers of this time period is John Calvin.
Oh,
Calvinism
oh.
comes out of this. And another well-known Anabaptist at this time period is, really quickly, we just want to cover this because I think it's very interesting, is a guy named Mebno Simons. What a weird name, right? But the only thing is his branch of Anabaptism will become the Mennonites, which branch off from the Amish. Yeah, in a way, I had to like study this whole thing. Like, what's the difference between a Mennonite and an Amish? A Mennonite will use a cell phone.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. They don't cling to technology. They don't. They're more technologically savvy. Yeah. They're on Vista. No, just kidding.
The others are horsepower.
Yeah, they actually understand how a tractor works. But out of that came the Mennonites.
Yeah.
And so it all came out of this thing. But really quickly, let's talk about John Calvin. And so out of this Anabaptist, he actually was stubbornly against what he called the superstitions of the papacy. And he started to write his own treatises, such as The State of the Souls of the Dead Prior to the Resurrection. And in 1536, he actually writes a huge book on what's known as the Institutes of the Christian Religion. And it has 6 chapters to it. This book is 516 pages long.
Holy.
It will cure any insomnia you have. Okay? But the only thing is that the way it's printed, he actually says will fit into wide pockets. And I'm like, what the hell big is this pocket?
Mailbags.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like, you guys will find out, but I'm also into, like, literally, I'm into, like, Revolutionary War reenactment, and I'll bring in a waistcoat or a waistcoat that has, like, the big wide pocket, and I'm like, how do you fit this thing in there? It's like a pizza box, okay? And so out of this, he writes the law, the Protestant creed is starting to come out of this. Now, I mean, this is just according to Calvin. He writes on the Lord's Prayer. He writes on the sacrament. And his last 2 chapters are on what he calls false sacraments and Christian freedoms. And after many successful publishings, he keeps adding to it, and it'll eventually become 4 books with 30 chapters. I'm imagining how big this thing is getting. It's got to be ridiculous by this time period.
Are we still on parchment at this point?
I think we're actually working on paper because I think when is the Gutenberg done again?
15.
Right about this time. We should be having the printing press. Well, yeah, but they are doing block printing, and so we do have paper at this time, not on parchment. We do have paper. We have very expensive, horrible paper. And so, so he has many other chapters involved on this, and talks about God in Revelation, the creation of the nature and the human creature. Second is God as a redeemer. He writes on the Old and New Testaments, Spirit, grace, and the fruits it produces. And finally, he writes about what will be the Reformed Church and its sacraments. All right? And so that's what we have for this week, gang. And I understand we have French toast downstairs. Thank you guys so much. Does anybody have any questions or anything before we go? See, yeah, Rick's not here, so it's not like 1,000. No, just kidding. Don't tape that. My friend Rick couldn't make it today. So.
It's on there.
Ah, crud. Sorry, Rick. All right. But, all right, guys, so we're going to cover, probably next week, we're going to cover that Church of England, how the humanists will then branch off and become the Church of England. And we'll just keep muddling through history, because it's still very interesting. Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you. How far are we going to the